everybody to our webinar today. Welcome, 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 welcome. It's great to see you. We will get started in just a moment or two. Let's just give a few moments for all of our colleagues to join us in the webinar room. If you can hear me, it would be absolutely fabulous if you could go down to the chat box on the right-hand side of the GoToWebinar panel and just write, "I can hear you," in the chat box. That would be absolutely brilliant, fantastic, marvelous, and wonderful. My name's Gareth Dyke. This will be a Bentham Science presentation, a webinar for authors, the right way to write. And we're going to give you some secrets of research writing. And as I mentioned, we will be getting started in just a few moments in order to give a little bit of time for a few more people to join us in the session. And thank you so much, Sarah. Thank you so much, Scott, for confirming that indeed you can hear me. And yes, in a moment, I will be turning on my webcam, but a few housekeeping remarks to get started with, just to give more of our colleagues the chance to join us in the webinar room today. We will have lots of time for Q&A at the end of our session today, so do feel absolutely free to put questions into the question box or drop them into the chat box. Both options for you are on the right-hand side there of your GoToWebinar control panel. Let me just click the button. There we go. You should now be able to see me. It's 2 minutes past the hour and we are all ready to get going with our presentation today. This is a Bentham Science presentation. It's a free webinar for authors. We're going to be talking about the right way to write and giving you a number of secrets, tricks and tips in academic writing. So let's get going. Let's get into it. Let's start off by giving you a little bit of information about Bentham Science Publishers. We are a growth publisher with more than 160 journals for you to choose from as a researcher to publish your next academic paper. So if you're wondering about the Bentham journals and you'd like to learn more, why not scan the QR code on the screen in front of you and you can register for a free 3-month journal trial. This gives you complete access to the entire Bentham catalogue, including more than 40 journals with impact factors, which is absolutely fantastic. You'll be able to discover our cutting-edge research and also stay updated as new articles get published in the Bentham catalogue. So that is absolutely fantastic and something that I can't understand why you wouldn't want to do. Scan the QR code there, get in touch with any members of our team, and you can see the Bentham catalogue. And as Sarah was just mentioning there in the chat box, of course, a recording of this webinar today will be made freely available. That's right, freely available to everybody attending this event. So wonderful stuff. We are Bentham Science. You can scan the QR code on the screen in front of you for a 3 months free trial. Absolutely free. It's not going to cost you a single penny piece. That's absolutely free for 3 months. Wonderful stuff and absolutely fantastic. Again, as we move through our training today, don't forget that you can put your questions into the chat box. Thank you so much for joining us. We are going to discuss 2 issues in our training presentation: English communication and some tips for English writing. We're talking, of course, about the right way to write, as well as some common mistakes, which is very important, because if you're a non-native English speaker and you're listening to this presentation, one of the ways that you can improve your writing skills in English of course, is to learn about the common mistakes that other researchers tend to make in their writing. And at Bentham, of course, we're publishing tens of thousands of papers every year in our more than 160 journals. So we get to see lots of errors, lots of mistakes. We help researchers to correct their English language in our articles. And so, of course, it's useful for you to learn from the mistakes of others. So English communication and writing skills and common mistakes and how to avoid them, because all of us get emails like this from journal editors all of the time. Dear sir, dear madam, many thanks for asking whether we would like to publish your paper. It's good and original, but unfortunately we are simply not willing to publish it. The good bits were not original, and the original bits were not good. English language writing is a major issue, a major blocker for our dear researcher colleagues around the world when they write their papers up for publication in Bentham and other international journals, because of course poor English writing can be a massive problem. Here's a list of common issues that we find in publisher surveys when we look at why international publishers reject research. Papers outside the journal scope, plagiarism, which we'll talk about a little bit more in a moment, incorrect formatting, poor English writing, the topic of our presentation today, as well as issues in peer review and recycled submissions. You can become a much more effective researcher publishing your work, writing it up and getting it into international journals if you learn from the mistakes of others. And of course, in our presentation today, we're talking about English writing. So let's get going, let's get into it, let's start thinking about English writing. Just a few examples that we got off of the good old internet. It is important that your writing gets your message across clearly. And of course, many hilarious examples online of where this hasn't happened, and I'm sure you've seen many yourself in your daily lives. It can be amusing, it can make us chuckle, but in our academic writing, in our English articles, we need to make sure that we get our message across clearly without mistakes, so that our papers will pass effectively into the peer review process and then hopefully finally to publication without any major issues. And English, of course, it's a good thing or a bad thing. It shouldn't be a blocker on your publication success. That's why we're here. That's why we provide these training webinars. English is, of course, the universal language of academic scientific communication. And what you'll find is that often academic papers need to be well written to a higher level of English than you might find in other writing. And so we are going to give you some tips, going to share with you some tricks that will hopefully help you to learn the right way to write in your English language. And I've got personally a few heroes when it comes to English language writing. Winston Churchill, you may have heard of him. He was, of course, the British Prime Minister around the time of the Second World War, and he's famous for using language to mobilize people. And JFK, the famous American president, said about Winston Churchill, he was able to mobilize the English language and send it into battle. And you may have read, you may have heard about some of the speeches, some of the writings of Winston Churchill. I've got two other heroes as well that come from my own background as a writer. Hadley Freeman, who's a journalist, who taught me that the best way to write is exactly the way that you think, and we'll come back to that in a moment. But thinking in English, writing as you think, is a great technique to follow if English is not your native language. If English is your second or third or fourth language, you can become more effective if you train yourself to think in English when thinking about your academic writing and academic articles. Thirdly, Another hero of mine, a guy called A.A. Gill, who was a travel and food writer. Who doesn't like travel and food? I know, but he was so dyslexic that he was unable to write for himself. So all of his great writing, absolutely fantastically written English, was spoken into a microphone, spoken into a dictaphone, and then transcribed and put down on paper. And that's another technique that you can use, that you can follow if you struggle with your English writing, training yourself to think in English, talk in English, write down what you are speaking about your research, and make a plan before you begin writing an academic paper. We always ask people in our Bentham Science webinars, how do you feel about writing in English? How do you feel? Do you carefully construct a plan beforehand, which you should, or do you just jump in without a plan? What kind of writer are you? You should be like Arnold in the middle of the slide. Arnold the bricklayer. You need to put a brick by brick structure together for your writing before you begin the process. Of course, that's the point of the training that we provide. That's what we are doing for you in these events. So how to write in English. Some tips and tricks. Try to think and write as you think. Try to write little and often. It's always a great idea to do a little bit of writing every day. 5 minutes, 10 minutes, doesn't matter, but do a little bit every day and think about your research. If you're a non-native English speaker listening to this event today, try to think in English and write down as you think. And you can also work with papers that you like and respect in your field. Find those. You've probably already got a whole selection of papers in your field that you use every day, that you often refer to, that you often read. Have a look at those papers for style, for shape, for structure and presentation. And do find a subject area specialist if you're going to translate. That's very important. We don't recommend it, but if you are going to translate into English from your native language, make sure the person doing the translation actually understands the subject area, because of course, as you know, lots of information can get lost in translation. So English, 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 the right way to write. Here are 6 features of good plain English that we have recognized, that commentators recognize around the world, that are characteristic of well-written and easy to understand language. Short sentences, no unnecessary words, familiar words, active verbs, active rather than passive voice, a clear style, and great punctuation. All of these we can help you with. If you get in touch with us, ask us about your articles, ask us to help you edit your papers, we will be delighted, very happy to do that, because there are key ways in which you can improve. 6 features of good plain English that you can have a think about in your writing. Short sentences, keep it short. No unnecessary words. Don't use unnecessary verbose words in your writing. We'll see some examples of this in a little bit as we go through the presentation. Don't forget to use active voice as much as possible rather than the passive voice. And we'll talk about that, I'm sure, in our Q&A a little bit later. You need to have a clear style and good punctuation. Also very, very, very important. So here are some basics of plain English for you. The right way to write: 1 complex idea per sentence. Using shorter sentences than longer ones. Compared to longer ones, it's a good idea to try to keep your sentences as short as possible, on average of around 20 words, and never as many as 50. You keep the verb and the subject close together. For example, we measured. Keep the verb and the subject close together. Favor active over passive verbs. We concluded, rather than it can be concluded that. That's an extra 3 or 4 words in that sentence, cutting out unnecessary adjectives and avoiding jargon. Short and simple words are best in your English writing. And of course, avoiding those horrible double negatives. Malaria is not uncommon. Malaria is common in this region, rather than writing malaria is not uncommon. So do have a think about these basics of plain English, the right way to write. And of course, some of the most common mistakes that we do see in English language writing include these particular issues: plagiarism, tenses and switches, spelling conventions, and inappropriate word use. So these are areas where colleagues around the world sending articles into our journals, and don't forget that we are proud to publish more than 160 journals at Bentham Science, thousands and thousands and thousands of papers every year. So we do get to see a lot of mistakes. And these are the most common ones. The point of showing you this is that you can learn from the mistakes that other people have made in the past. Of course you can. If you know where those common mistakes are, then you can avoid them in your own writing. A very useful technique, especially for people who do not speak English as a first language. So let's get into it. Let's talk about some of the issues that we see in English academic writing. The right way to write. Academic plagiarism is something that many people around the world don't understand effectively enough. And of course, in order to avoid plagiarizing, you've got to understand what that means. The appropriation of another person's ideas, processes, results, or words without giving proper credit. This is academically dishonest, of course, because we are expected to do our own work. And of course, nobody listening to this is ever going to go to another piece of published work online or on a paper that they've read and just cut and paste text out of that into their own work. We're all aware that that's not okay. We're all aware that that's not allowed. But there are other kinds of plagiarism that people are less aware of. So have a think about this for a moment. And why don't you write for me in the question box which of these you think is plagiarism? Okay, have a go. Find the A, B, C, and D buttons there on your keyboard or on your phone if you're listening to this on your smartphone. Which of these is plagiarism? Is it A, reading the work of others to gather information? Is it B, using the work of others and calling it your own? Is it C, citing the work of others to support your argument? Or is it D, examining the work of others to shape your argument? Which of these is plagiarism? Now, let's have a think. I am seeing some answers coming into the question box, so thank you so much for that. And universally, we're all going for option B. Of course, plagiarism is using the work of another and calling it your own. And so if you are clear about that, as a researcher, you should avoid doing that, because this is the #1 reason that academic papers get rejected before peer review at international journals. There is always a plagiarism check that gets conducted by the publisher, Bentham Science in this case, on incoming academic papers submitted to journals. First thing that happens, they get assessed by the editor, of course. Are they suitable for the journal? And then they get sent to a plagiarism checking software. Turnitin being one of the most common, to check for levels of plagiarism. And if there's more than 10% highlighted in the paper, then of course it will get immediately rejected. And you don't want that, because this could get you blacklisted from lots of different journals from a single publisher. So, of course, we're all aware of that, but did you know that you are not allowed to use your own work again in your subsequent papers unless you cite yourself? And many researchers are unaware of this as an issue. So they get caught out putting figures, putting text, putting maps from their previous published work into later publications without citing themselves. You've got to cite yourself, even if you wrote the first paper. You've got to put the reference to your own earlier work into your later work. So self-plagiarism, of course, that's an attempt to take any of your own previously published text, papers, or research results and make them appear new. You've got to cite yourself. So you cannot use a data set from a previous study without making the reader aware of this. You cannot submit a manuscript for publication that contains data, conclusions, or passages that have already been published. You've got to cite those previous studies, even if it's your own work. And lots of researchers simply don't know that. They think, hey, I made that figure, or I made that map, I own that, I don't need to cite my earlier publication, but you do, and you can get caught out if you don't. And finally, of course, don't do this. It's very, very naughty, publishing multiple similar papers about the same study in different journals. We call this salami slicing. It's not ethical. It's not allowed. You will get caught if you try to do it. So, as a mistake, as a common area of issue for authors around the world, plagiarism is top of the list. Top of the list. Number one mistake that researchers tend to make. What's number two? Well, that's to do with tenses. Which tenses should I use in the different sections of my paper? People often ask. Well, in the introduction, the materials and methods, the results and discussion, you will use different tenses. And of course, throughout most of your writing, to keep it simple, as we've talked about before, it's better to use the present tense as much as possible. So in answer to this very common question that we often get asked by researchers around the world, which tense to use in which section of my paper, the present tense is used most often. But of course, in the methods, you're going to use the past tense because you're talking about work that was done in the past, and you'll be mixing around in the results and discussion, but primarily the present tense, please, as much as possible, keeping your writing simple in your articles. So that's another common area of researcher confusion that we wanted to highlight in this presentation today, as well as spelling conventions. Lots of people are, of course, aware that British English and American English have different spelling and tense conventions, but you should not mix them up in a single paper. And that's a mistake that's very often made by researchers. They don't set their word up to check spelling properly. They mix around the British and American English in a single paper, and that causes confusion. It makes the paper look messy to editors and peer reviewers, and it often leads to rejection. So be consistent. Check your journal. Is your journal asking you for a particular style? They might say, we prefer British English, or they might say, we prefer American English, or they might say, we don't mind, but be consistent. So have a look at these spelling conventions. Keep them in mind for your next paper, because that is also very, very important. My personal favorite, by the way, did you know that the color gray is spelled differently in American English and in British English? And that's an example for you down there at the bottom of the slide. So that's mistake number two in English academic writing. What was mistake number one? Plagiarism, especially self-plagiarism. What was mistake number two? Well, it was the use of tenses. What was mistake number three? American versus British English in your articles. Now, my favorite, word use. Word use. If you write in English academic writing using emotional words, fantastic, marvelous, amazing, fantastic, then people think that your work is not serious. You can't develop a logical argument using emotional words. And avoid those superlatives. very much more gigantic, earth-shattering, magnificent, marvelous, fantastic. You don't want those in your English academic writing. Why? Because they make the reader feel like the work is not serious. So be careful with your word use. It's a common mistake, especially for non-native speakers. I edited a paper last week written by a dear colleague in China, which was entitled The Fantastic Potential of Land Use Change in China. Now, fantastic in the title of an academic research article is not the best word use choice. So keep that in mind as well as you write your papers, and you learn, I hope, from us the right way to write. You cannot, in English, make much out of your adjectives. Many of them are absolute adjectives in English. A petri dish is either sterile or it's not. For example, it can't be very sterile, quite sterile, or fairly sterile, and an object is unique, not very unique. Okay, so be careful with your word use. Be careful with your choices of words and also qualification, especially of adjectives in academic writing. We don't have time in this presentation today to go into lots of details in this webinar, but if you'd like us to come back, Sidetrain, Bentham Science, and give you another presentation, perhaps to your students, research group, to your university, on the details of academic writing, we do that all the time, and we'd love the opportunity to do that in your case. So do get in touch with us. Do drop us a message in the chat if that would be something you would like us to do. So have a look at this word use. It's mistake number 5 in our list of common English language mistakes. Have a look at these sentences. Can you spot the problems? Do they sound funny? Sentence number 1. Using multiple regression techniques, the animals in experiment 1 were. In assessing the damage, the plants exhibited numerous lesions. The spiders were inadvertently discovered while repairing a faulty growth chamber. So if you have a read of these sentences, you can see that the order of words is not correct, especially in sentence 3. The spiders were inadvertently discovered while repairing the faulty growth chamber. It sounds like the spiders were doing the growth chamber repair work, which is not, of course, what the reader meant to say. So do keep that in mind. Do have a think about how you use your words. And one of the best ways to check your word use is, of course, to share it with somebody else or read it out. Read out your work after you've written it. Read it out to the mirror, the dog, the cat, your granny. See how it sounds, because that's the best way to catch a lot of these common issues. And then, of course, my personal favorite, mistake number 6 in English academic writing is the use of unnecessary words, because this just makes it sound sloppy in your science. It has long been known that usually means that the writer has not bothered to look up the answer. Correct to an order of magnitude probably means the answer is wrong. Almost reached significance at the 5% level. Well, that just means a selective interpretation of results. Your text, as we've talked about before, in English will be easier to understand if you use simple words and phrases to replace more complicated ones. So say similar rather than analogous. Say utilize rather than use. Say terminate and say end rather than terminate, excuse me. Say use rather than utilize. Keep your writing simple. Keep it easy to understand, because of course most of your readers will be non-native speakers. Unnecessary words, be that as it may. However, nevertheless, indeed, and meanwhile, try to cut these out of your writing if at all possible. And another common mistake that we often see in writing is mixing up the use of the words that and which in English. These two words can be used to help make our meanings and relationships clearer, but we do need to use them correctly. The lawnmower, which is broken, is in the garage. The lawnmower that is broken is in the garage. So is the lawnmower that works. Another example of a correct sentence. However, down at the bottom, you've got an incorrect use of the word which. And the best way to determine if these are good or not in your own writing is to read your work out loud. Of course, as well, we often see, and I've lost count now of the number of mistakes that we've covered in this part of the presentation. I think we're up to 7 or 8, but extra redundant words are also commonly seen in academic writing in English. That man is blue in colour. Well, of course, in colour is not necessary. You can just say that man is blue. Small, rectangular, blue, tenuous. You do not need to say that spider is small in size. That box is rectangular in shape. That man is blue in colour. Your hypothesis is tenuous in nature. Redundancy in English academic writing is very commonly seen with your examples. So keep that in mind. Avoid extra redundant words. We are going for clear, effective writing techniques as we learn the right way to write. Signal your research question. Keep a consistent order. Repeat key terms. Use a consistent point of view. Put parallel ideas in a parallel form and use topic sentences with transitions and key terms. We've got lots more content on this. Scott, thank you for your question. You can indeed book a special workshop for your researchers next week. Do get in touch with us. We will provide you with the booking details at the end of this presentation. If anyone else would like to book a special workshop for their researchers, then do drop your contact information or ask a question there in the question box, because an effective research question lets the reader know what you're doing. It sets up an expectation for the rest of the paper or the grant. You should use explicit phrases, question words, whether or which. State your hypothesized effect and identify very clearly in your article the types of variables and your study design, because scientific writing is important to get right. As we talked about before, using words that don't make sense, using too many words, keeping the writing complicated is difficult, makes it harder for people to understand what you are getting at with your work. So don't use contractions. Didn't, can't, haven't, because they sound informal. The word data is plural, and this is a very common mistake in scientific writing. The data were collected, not the data was collected. The data were. That's a pluralization. Avoid direct quotes in your academic writing unless you are presenting another author's specific definition or original label. Paraphrase, but always take care to properly cite your sources. And if you'd like to learn more about paraphrasing, of course, we're definitely able to help you with that. So again, that would be something that we'd follow up on in another workshop along the road. If you'd like us to do that for your institution, get in touch. Don't forget to read and reread your references. Consult a textbook or another reference to help you resolve any aspects of your paper that you do not understand before you start. And review your writing. Read it out to a mirror, the dog, the cat, your granny, I don't know, but that's the best way to make sure that you don't make any unnecessary mistakes. Making sure that each sentence presents one or two clear ideas. And this also helps you to organize your paragraphs into effective structure, because people get confused in their English writing. And here are some examples of common areas of confusion. Different words meaning different things that people often mix up. Fewer and less, infer, imply, as, because, disinterested, uninterested, alibi, excuse, data and datum, the plural and singular, later and latter, causal and casual, loose and lose, mute and moot, discrete and Discrete. We've got lots of words in English that sound the same, but have different meanings and different spellings. A standard dictionary, a standard thesaurus will help you understand the correct meaning of words. But if you are confused, get in touch with us or use a simpler version of the word that you wish to include on these slides here, intended as a resource. When you get this presentation later, and of course people are asking in the chat for a copy of this presentation, of course, absolutely do get in touch with the Bentham team. We would be delighted to send you this PowerPoint. Of course, pronouns, correct spelling, including the use of plurals, are big issues in academic writing. We won't read out all of this text. They are areas for you to have a look at later, resources for you to have a look at later, or if you'd like to book us for a follow-up presentation, then do get in touch. Of course, we'd love to do that. We've talked about the use of abstract words. Use concrete words rather than abstract ones to achieve clarity and precision. Use abstract nouns, the measurement of storm intensity, to be available night and day on a 24-hour basis. Be careful with the use of the present participle. After standing in boiling water for an hour, examine the flask. It doesn't make sense. Read out your work before you send it to an academic journal. And we've got lots of content, lots of information available on our Bentham Science website to help you with your scientific writing. Punctuation, when to use commas and when to use semicolons. A comma goes in a sentence to denote a brief pause between groups of words, or to separate subclauses, or to separate all items in a list except for the last two. So have a think about how you use your punctuation, how you put together your writing, because in your academic writing, it is important to be more or less specific most of the time. Avoid cliches like the plague, because of course they are old hat. Verbs has to agree with their subjects. Prepositions are not words to end sentences with. And don't start a sentence with a conjunction. Is it wrong to ever split an infinitive? And parenthetical remarks, however relevant, are usually unnecessary. Now we're joking. Now we're showing you some funny examples of the kinds of writing that you should avoid, but we do not want sentence fragments. No sentence fragments. Contractions aren't good style and shouldn't be used in formal writing. Do not be redundant. Do not use more words than necessary. One should never generalize. One-word sentences. Eliminate. Eliminate commas that are not necessary. And never use a big word when a diminutive one would suffice. Kill all those exclamation points. Use words correctly, irregardless how others use them. Understatement is always the absolutely best way to put forth earth-shaking ideas. Use the apostrophe in its proper place and omit it when it's not needed. And who needs rhetorical questions? Proofread, proofread, and proofread carefully to see if you any words out. Very, very important, keeping these examples in mind. So, we are Bentham Science. Thank you so much for listening today. Don't forget we've got time for questions. Do write any of your questions if something has sprung into your mind over the course of this free webinar today. Do write them in the question box. We will be delighted to answer them while we're thinking about if we have any questions. And thank you for the kind feedback as well, everybody. Do scan the QR code that you can see on the screen. Share it with your friends, your relatives, your enemies, your family. Share it with everybody that you know so that they can all access a free 3-month trial of all of our Bentham Journal content, which of course is a complete collection of more than 160. That's right, 160 journals, including 40 or more with impact factors. We are here to empower your researchers with a wealth of knowledge. You can discover, cutting edge research in science, technology, and medicine with Bentham, and you can stay updated with new articles, which of course get added every month. It's a great opportunity to learn about Bentham. It's a great opportunity to access our Bentham content for 3 months without any charge at all, which means, of course, you will not have to pay a single penny piece. Get in touch if you have any further questions about this presentation. My name's Gareth, and this has been a Bentham Science presentation, The Right Way to Write, Secrets of Research Writing. Thank you so much for joining today. We have talked about English communication and writing skills, as well as common mistakes that authors do tend to make in their writing. There will be a certificate issued if you attended this presentation, and everybody will also get access to the recording. If you get in touch with us, we will send you a copy of the presentation. And yes, Sarah, it will indeed be uploaded onto the Bentham YouTube channel. As there are no questions, and as this is a live presentation, I'm going to say happy Thursday, everybody. Have a great day, and talk to you in our next Bentham Science presentation. Have a fantastic day. Take care.